This is not a tutorial. It is a comprehensive course that will teach you everything that you need to know to master Tailwind CSS and will also give you the confidence to build well designed applications using Tailwind CSS. Now, be it any of my course landing pages or my website, a lot of recent projects that I have used all use Tailwind CSS. And initially, I hated it, but eventually, I learned to love it because of all the advantages that we will go through in this specific course. Now, we will be using Next.js alongside Tailwind, so you will be learning a little bit of that as well. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, what is Tailwind CSS? Tailwind CSS is a CSS framework, just like how we have Next.js, which is a framework for specifically building JavaScript applications, or like Vue or Angular. Similarly, Tailwind CSS is a CSS framework. That means it is going to allow us to and design our applications faster using Tailwind. Now, Tailwind does have a bunch of different advantages that we will be going through throughout this course, but I want to highlight a couple here. One is that you don't have to come up with class names all the time because you are creating those styles inline. Now, creating those styles inline might look ugly at first. Not having the headache to come up with class names is going to be a huge game changer for us. Because at the end of the day, we keep calling container for everything or wrapper for everything. And this is something that we don't really want to do. We don't have to deal with the headache of that. Second, Tailwind gives us a design system out of the box. That means we already have a set of preset colors, specific font sizes, styling, and a lot of different utilities that Tailwind gives you out of the box. So you don't have to come up with any of that from scratch. You can use them right away, which again gives you a really solid foundation. Now, if you ask our designer friends, you will notice that in their Figma files, a lot of these styles are already preset as well. They have spacing defined, they have colors defined, and so on. Similarly, Tailwind CSS has the same idea when we don't have our designer friends around where we can start building our applications. But we will also be covering how to use Tailwind CSS if you do have an existing design system that you're using in your existing company. But there's a lot more to Tailwind that we'll be covering throughout this course. Now let's get started by installing Tailwind CSS in our application. So if we head over to the Tailwind CSS documentation, you will notice that they have a really comprehensive guide to install Tailwind in any project that you want. But because we are using Next.js in our app, Tailwind is provided to us by default and we can configure it as we set it up. So as long as we have these system requirements for installing Next.js, we can get started with Next.js right away. So let's copy this command and then head over to our terminal to install a Next.js app which has Tailwind pre-configured. So for example, if I go here and then hit enter, let's call this app Doggos and we will walk you through the app as well that we will be building. Let's just go with the default and here you want to say yes. Would you like to use Tailwind CSS? Yes, I want to. And then just go with whatever default that they have. This will install all the dependencies to get our app up and running. And there you go. Now I'm going to change directory to Doggos. And then let's open up this specific app in VS Code. Now, VS Code will be the editor, that is, Visual Studio Code will be the editor of choice for this specific course, but feel free to use whatever editor you like. Now, this is the code for it, but let's go ahead and start the server. As we start the server, we can go to localhost 3000 and look at that. We have a Next.js app ready to go. And if we head over to VS Code itself and expand this a little bit, you will notice that we have a tailwind.config.ts file. And in the page, you can see that there are a bunch of Tailwind styles here as well. So it is using Tailwind CSS by default in this specific application. But you know what? We don't need any of these styles because we are going to build something custom for us. So let's just get rid of it. And let's just add an H1 saying, hi, doggos. And let's also add a emoji for doggos. Perfect. So now if we head over to our server, the browser, you can see hi doggos is printed right there, which is amazing, which is exactly what we want. Now notice that even though we are using H1, hi doggos doesn't have necessarily the styles of H1 that we want. So let's start learning Tailwind CSS in general now. So for example, if we were to style H1, we need to start using Tailwind utilities. Now, if you were to style the specific H1 in typically CSS, you would add, let's say, a style attribute here or a class name, for example. And then you can say that I want this specific, the font size to be like 2 rem, and then I want the line height to be 1.2 rem, and so on. This is how exactly you would style in CSS. But in our case, Tailwind does provide us with several utilities. Now, utilities are essentially these specific pre-existing classes that Tailwind provides us that we can use right away, and it usually combines a bunch of different styles together. So, if you have to compare that to in the JavaScript world, you can think as like a function that you can sort of use and apply those styles to. So, instead of style, we can get rid of this and just say class name, and we can use a specific utility from Tailwind called as text XL or whatever. Now, if I just do a control space on it, you can see that we have text small, which means font size is going to be this and line height is going to be this. In our case, we maybe want 3XL, which is 3 times the size, and that's basically the specific font size. Now, flex, min H screen, flex call, item center, justify between, P24, Text 3XL, and all of these are essentially Tailwind utilities that Tailwind gives you out of the box. Now, if I save it and head over to the browser, you can see that now the font size is actually quite big, which is exactly what we want. Now, but this is the benefit of using something like Tailwind, where we don't have to think of new class names to give this specific H1, or you don't have to keep switching files. You can just directly use an existing utility that Tailwind provides us out of the box and get started right away. Now, when I did enter text Excel and I entered command space, for example, text Excel, you can see all these different styles. Now, the reason why I'm able to do that is because of Tailwind Intellisense. So, for example, this is a specific VS Code plugin called Tailwind CSS Intellisense that gives you that additional intelligence so you don't have to keep going to the documentation, but just look up styles that you want in line. So, for example, you can see over here, instead of Excel, there's large, and then as you hover over it, it essentially gives you whatever large is. But because we have two styles of the same type, it's saying that there's a conflict, but we don't need to worry about it. So make sure you basically get that specific plugin because it's going to make your development a lot simpler. I also write a weekly free newsletter called as Frontend Snacks, frontendsnacks.dev. If you're really interested, then check out the link in the description below or just head over to frontendsnacks.dev where I teach you something new in the front end world every single week. And I do that using visuals and more interactive elements. But at the same time, I also give you what's latest and greatest in the front end world. And lastly, a front end developer toolbox to help you with tools that you can use in your job day to day. So if you're really interested, please check the description below and sign up at frontendsnacks.dev. All right, back to the course. Now let's walk you through the setup of this specific project and how Tailwind is configured. Now, in order to know more about Tailwind, you need to dig into two things. One is the tailwind.config.ts file. Now, this is the global Tailwind configuration file that is provided to you. Now, this is an optional file. You don't necessarily need it. If you want to update the existing design system that Tailwind comes with, you can essentially update this specific file. Or if you just want to get rid of it completely because you're working with a design team and they already have a bunch of styles and a design system pre-configured, then you can pretty much replace that design system that Tailwind comes with as well. And this is the file where you do that. The next file you need to go to is the global.css file. A global.css file is the global CSS configuration file, And I want you to look at these three lines: base, components, and utilities. Now, these are really important in Tailwind. If you want to override anything globally, for example, in our case, if you want to override H1 altogether, so whenever we use H1 in anywhere in the project, then you want to basically go ahead and use base. So, for example, in our case, instead of inlining it right here, let's get rid of this altogether. And if we go to global.css, we can use a specific directive called as layer, which again Tailwind provides us with. And then we can say base. This is essentially saying that we want to add more styles to base. And here we can just go ahead and style H1. Now you can use Tailwind's apply directive to essentially extract repeatable styles and combine a bunch of utilities. So for example, I can say apply, and then here I can pass in whatever utilities I want from Tailwind. I can say that I want it to be text 6XL, for example. But at the same time, I want to add another utility called as font to make the font more bolder or lighter or thinner or whatever you want it to be. Again, when we go to font and then do control space, you can see all of these here. In our case, let's just go with semi-bold. Now, if you go back to our browser and go to our app, you can see now Hi Doggos is actually bolder and it's actually text XL. That means the font size is quite huge, which is exactly what we want for our H1. But for example, going back to our global.css file, base is where you would go to essentially apply the global files that you want. The next thing is components. So Tailwind components. Whenever you want to again use repeatable styles, you want to extract specific styles and combine them into existing components. For example, if you want to create a button primary component, then again you can do the same thing, layer components, and then here instead of using H1 or instead of using H1, you can actually give it a class name. So you can say button primary to be whatever. And then again, using the apply directive to apply extracted utilities, you can give whatever styles that you want. So for example, I can say, I want the background to be whatever. I want the background to be this color if I want. This essentially is a component with a specific background. So components is essentially used for that. But in our case, we don't need that for now. So let's get rid of it. The last one is the utilities. And again, as we looked at earlier, when we tried to style H1, utilities are essentially repeatable class names that we want to use that combines one or two or more CSS classes together. And you can think of them as JavaScript functions where you combine a bunch of things together. For that specific function, you get that specific functionality. And then again, you can use utilities and create custom utilities that Tailwind doesn't provide you as well. So for example, in this case, again, we can say layer, utilities. Similarly, now let's say we do want a utility for something that just aligns our text to the left all the time. So for example, I can just say align left. And here I can pass in any specific styles that I want in utilities. So I can say, again, apply directive and then just say text left. So now anytime we use this specific utility, align left, then it will automatically align it to the left hand side. Now, if you don't want this, and if you just want to say align left with a hyphen, just like we have in the Tailwind CSS styles, then we can do the same as well. This essentially became a utility class name that we can use, and we do need a dot here. So again, if Tailwind doesn't provide us with any utilities out of the box, then we can create something custom whenever we need it in this specific directive. Now again, we don't need any of that, so we can remove it altogether. So now that we have a really basic understanding of how Tailwind works, and what utilities are, components are, how to override a global file, and so on. How about we now take a look at the application that we are going to build? Now, if we head over to the application that we are going to build, it's called Hello Doggos. It's very simple. Yes, we are creating a bunch of text styles, but at the same time, we have all these images of dogs and again, you can use any images that you want here, basically styling the specific card in a different way. But when you hover over it, you can see that it's animating as well. So again, this is a very simple application that we will be building as we go along learning Tailwind in this specific course. Now, Tailwind comes up with an existing design system. And what I mean by that is if you go head over to the Tailwind documentation, let's say we go to colors, then these are all the colors that Tailwind provides us. For example, you can just say text color 50 and this specific color will apply and so on. Now, similarly, it also comes up with a bunch of different spacing attributes as well that we can use. And again, the spacing is also predefined as well. So we can just use that or we could completely override it if you like. And we also have different breakpoints as well. So for example, this means that the min width is going to be 640 versus MD is going to be 768 and so on. But all of this is already pre-configured for us, which means that it gives us a design system that we can just use right away. And if we don't want that, let's say we want to do something custom, we are okay with the font size, but we want to make it even bigger or a specific font size that specifically it is our designer friends have like sort of given to us so that we can use in our application. Then in that case, we could do the same in tailwind config.ts file. Going back to our code, we can head over to tailwind.config.ts. Now here you can see that we have this specific theme attribute, theme object, and extend. Now this is where we can extend anything that we want, any of the existing utilities. So for example, if we want to extend a specific color, then we could do that here. So we can say color and then pass whatever values that we want. Now keep this in mind. If we go to colors in our customization, it goes from 50 to 950 in all these different colors. But let's say for the color purple, we do want to add one more. Now, you can follow these specific conventions. So you can say 950, you can say 1000 and so on. But in our case, we could also say 950, 951, 52 and increment by 1, which sort of shows us that it is a custom color that we have added. So here we can say purple because that's the name of the color and then pass in 951 or 952, whatever we want, and then pass in any color that we want. So I can just say 5755EB, which is my brand color, and give it a comma here as well. So now we have extended purple to have an additional color. So now if I head over to page TSX, give it a class name here and say color text purple. One is what we want. If we go here and we don't see the color, so if we head over to tailwind.config.ts file, this should be colors. And then if we head back, you can see that hi doggos is purple in fact, and we can use that specific custom color right away. Similarly, we could do the same for other utilities as well. So there are no limitations. But let's say we don't want to use the utilities at all that Tailwind provides us. I mean, we like the idea of creating utilities. We like the utility first approach that Tailwind provides us. So we'll still be using Tailwind because there are other benefits to it, such as not coming up with new class names. But we already have a design system that we want to use and we don't want to use Tailwind. Then in that case, you could do that as well. Again, we could do the same in tailwind.config.ts file. So for example, if we can just pretty much get rid of everything and just replace it directly with color. So now if I say purple, and again, instead of saying 950, because now we no longer have a scale, we can just say 100. And this could be again the same color that I added. And if I head over to page.tsx file, then you can see that purple only has the 100 attribute, 100 value that we specifically added and nothing else. So going back to browser, purple still works, but that's it. Like if you want to add any specific colors, any specific spacing and so on, you could easily override it as well and provide it your custom design system as needed. So this is the beauty of Tailwind in general. Now let's learn about spacing. So spacing as in padding, margin, or space between, just like we see in the Tailwind docs. Now, again, padding, margin, and space between are essentially utilities that Tailwind provides us, and you can control an element's padding through this. And these are all the utilities that we have. So if you just want P0, then that means padding is 0 pixel. Similarly, if we want just PT, that is padding top, then it will only apply that specific padding value to the top of that element. And if you want padding to be on the all sides or both sides, then we can use X and Y values as well. So for example, PX2 will only apply padding on the left hand side and the right hand side, versus PY would be applying padding to the top and the bottom as well. The same thing is applicable in margin as well. The good thing about Tailwind is that it has consistency in all these utilities. A lot of the styling would be applicable. So the more you get comfortable with it, the better it is. So again, similarly, we have M5 with 2.5, which means margin top is going to be this value versus margin bottom is going to be the other value. And again, we also have the same thing with space between as well. So for example, if you do want to control the space between child elements, then we could use any of these specific utilities for controlling the space between. So for example, in a flex box, you can just say space x4, which means that it's going to give it the horizontal space between specific elements. So now in our case, in our application, let's just style these two elements right here and provide some sort of spacing in general. So we can get the same sort of styling that we want in the other app. So now if I go back here, we can pretty much get rid of all of this. And now here, let's give it the styling that we want. So for example, let's say we want a padding around that specific element, which is on the vertical spacing side. And we can just say padding could be any of these values, and we want to pick padding as 20. Similarly, padding on the x-axis itself, we can say padding should be 10. Again, we can do the control space, and it also gives us that padding. And this padding means that padding left is going to be 2.5 rem, and padding right is going to be 2.5 rem as well. And this is going to give the padding to the entire container. This way there is some spacing when we start adding text around it in general. Now, if we head over to our browser, you can see that we have something like this. Now, we can get rid of this color because remember in global.css file, we do have this specific style, so we don't need it. But there's one more property that we need, which is that we need an h2 here. So we can just say the best doggos in town. And for H1, H2, and so on, we want to make sure that we are styling it at a base level that so all H2s look the same. So we can just say H2 and then add the styling that we want. So here we can give it a smaller size for H2, and again, we want to make sure that we have some sort of medium bold sizing to the font weight to the specific style as well. So we can just say font is medium. And font medium applies font weight of 500, whereas semi-bold applies it to 600. So H2, it makes sense. So if we go back, you can see that the best doggos in town are also styled, which is really good. But let's make sure that we have some spacing like we learned right here. So again, if we were to give spacing, then we can just say spacing and then margin my to be whatever that we want. So going back here, we can just say margin is going to be 12. So when we say something like this, it means margin top is 3 rem and margin bottom is 3 rem. So now if we head over here to our app, you can see that our app is sort of starting to come together in general, which is really good. Now in our application, we do want to make sure that it's actually in the center. So we can give it some padding throughout. So we can just say padding is going to be 16 or something, which is like a 4 rem of padding. So we could do that. But at the same time, we can just center the element as well. And we can use margin auto for that, which will set. And as we already know in CSS, we do need some sort of width for that. So we also have a specific utility in Tailwind called as max width Excel, so which will give it the max width that we want as well. This way things are in the center in general. So we can just say this could be 6XL. And look at that. Now our items are squished because the max width of it is much lower than the screen size. So again, like these are all the utilities that we can start using in Tailwind to give space. Now you can see that there are these lines here. In general, we really don't want that. And if you remember, this specific project came with some pre-existing styles. So if we head over to global.css, you can see we do have these different colors added and different RGB colors. Again, let's get rid of all of that. So now our application looks a lot better. If you're truly interested in learning Tailwind, then you should also check out the code that I'm using in this specific course. You can choose to follow along, or you could also just grab the code necessary. Please follow the link in the description below and let me know and I will send you the code. Gradients really help to make our application look really cool. And luckily for us, Tailwind does provide us with a few gradients out of the box, and so we can like create gradients really easily. So for example, if you want something like a linear gradient, that is it goes from left to right or right to left in a linear way, then you can use any of these specific gradient utilities, for example. So you can use something like BG gradient to top. T stands for top. TR is top right, then just right, to bottom to bottom left, and so on. So these different utilities really help us, and then we can basically add any sort of colors as well as we like. So for example, if we say background to gradient to R, then you can just say from to. Again, another other utilities from and to allow us to essentially say I want to go from this color to this other color, and that really makes it really easy. In our application as well, you can see we do have three different colors. We have the purple here, we have some blue shade or indigo, I guess, and like also more pink shade as well. So we could do that with gradients and linear gradients itself using Tailwind. So let's do that. So for example, here again in base itself, if I say that we want body, and then I just want to say apply. Again, apply directive will allow us to apply those styles or those utilities in general. Then I can just say, because we want a gradient to go from left to right, we can just say background gradient to right, and then whatever color we want. So we can say purple and so on. Now let's just remove this altogether, because we don't really want to get rid of any of the styles that we want. We do want all the colors, so we can say whatever colors that we want from here. So we can say purple, from purple 300. And if we want to add a third color, we could do that as well using any property that we like as well. So for example, these are the gradient color stops that we saw, the start color, right? So that's for example the starting color, then the ending color. And again, if you want a middle color, then we can add via, which gives us that three color shade that we want. So again, if I say from this, then I want to pink 500, but then I do want a via property as well, a via color as well. And say indigo is going to be 200. Now, if we go back to our application, you can see that it has those three colors as we like, similar to this specific application as well. So 1, 2, and 3. And this is a little bit darker, so we can always make it lighter. So again, you can see 1, 2, and 3 are the different colors that we want. Now, get creative here, add whatever colors you want. But this specific gradient can also be applied to a button as well if we have a button in general, because this is essentially a background image. And you can just apply this specific gradient utilities to anything that you want. Next, let's add the names of these dogs and also the images as well. Now, again, feel free to use whatever images you want and also make up names as you like. Now, fun fact, this is my dog Kobe, but there are these other dogs as well that you can just make up or use dog photos in general or whatever photos you like. So for example, over here we have these six dogs, and we could just essentially create an array with like Sydney, Dora, Ollie, Kobe, and Danny and Drew as names, for example, with the name property. And then we can also add in an image here as well. So now I have already done that work for us, so we can focus on learning Tailwind. So for example, we do have an array of objects with all the dog names. And there's a reason why we have have it in an object, because then we can add additional properties as we like, so that we could style them further if you want as well. But again, let's not get into that right now. And then we are mapping in that specific array, and then here we're just passing in specific keys. So we have the name as h2s, and then, or we could just say maybe h3s, it doesn't matter, but whatever we want. And then image, and image is essentially the Next.js image component right here, and I've passed in a specific width and height as well. Now, because I have already stored the images here as and called it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The good thing about this is we can just, as we loop through the array, we can just say 0 plus 1, because array's index starts from 0. We can say 0 plus 1, that would be essentially the first image and second image, and so on. So this makes it really easy for us to construct it. So if we go to our app and if we just do a quick refresh, you can see that all these dogs have disappeared in essentially a column. But do we want a column? We actually want some sort of a grid. We want like either flexbox, or we want like a grid itself to create a structure we want. So next, let's take a look at that next. Now let's learn how we can add flexbox or grid to our specific application, essentially controlling the display of the elements, so that we can say if we want it to be inline or flexbox or grid and so on. So again, there are utilities for that in Tailwind, and you can, whenever we say display, for example, block, then you can just apply class block. Similarly, if you want to apply grid, then you can just say grid. This way you don't have to say display grid, you can just say grid. Same thing for flexbox as well, or even table and so on. Instead of saying flexbox, you say flex, which is right here. So if we want to make sure that we add flex, for example, then we can just say flex. But then flex also has additional items, such as you want to center the element, you want to center it horizontally, you want to center it vertically, and so on. So again, Tailwind also has utilities for that. So you can just say item center, or you could just say justify center, and so on. So depending on what you're looking for, you can do that. But in our case, in our application, we are going to use a grid. It is a 3 by 3 grid, for example. So we want 1, 2, and 3 columns. So in CSS, we would do that is by saying display grid. And then we would say we want grid of 3 columns. So for that, we can head over to the grid section. And here we can just say create grid to create a grid container. So we can just say grid. And then since we want 3 columns, we can just say grid calls 3. So if we head over to our application over here itself, we can say, or rather outside, because we don't want the grid to repeat, we can just say grid, which again, if we hover over it, it says display grid. And then grid calls 3, which means it's going to add 3 columns for us. That's equivalent to grid template columns, repeat 3. And then we can see what that looks like. So for example, if you go back, you can see automatically has transformed into 3 columns. But let's make sure that there are some gaps between the elements as well, because right now it's like really sticking to next to each other. So for that as well, we have gap as a property. In grid, instead of giving it like specific CSS property for gap, we can just say, let's give it gap 2, for example. Now, if we head back, you can see that there is some gap between the elements. But now, if we were to shrink this page, you can see that it is also shrinking all the way. But in our case, in our application, what we would like is when it goes into like a tablet size, then changes into 2 columns. But the minute it goes into a mobile device as well, then also it says in the same column, but sort of shrinks itself. We want something like some functionality like that. So let's learn more about how we can add responsive styling with Tailwind next. Responsive design. Now, we have so many different screen sizes. We have a laptop, mobile, and all sorts of sizes. At the same time, we have tablets and so on. Also, really wide screen monitors. So, we really need to make sure that we are styling accordingly. Now, in CSS, in the CSS world, we would essentially be using media queries. and then saying that if its min width is this and max width is that, then essentially this is what the behavior should be. So if you have added over and over again media queries everywhere. But with Tailwind, it's really simple. Like it really helps us to write responsive styles in a really easier way. And I think it's way better than what we have in CSS, even though internally it's CSS styling. But having those utilities really help. Now that we go back to the docs, we have these breakpoint prefix that allows us to say that we want the min width to be 640, and that will be the small prefix. So anytime you add a specific style, so for example, if I say MD is W32, that means starting from min width MD, which is starting from 768 pixel, automat and up, it is going to be with 32 or with whatever width 32 is in Tailwind. Similarly, we have LG, XL, 2XL, and so on. Now, here's the thing. Tailwind does use the concept of mobile first, which is something that I really love as well. So instead of basically designing for desktop, we design for a mobile device. And depending on the application that you're using, you can decide how you wanna what your breakpoints should be like. But with mobile first design itself, you're targeting the mobile devices first. You specifically by default, those would be the styles, and then you are coding for larger devices later, because more and more our users are going to be on our cell phones, and we are using desktop less and less. So this is why it's really important that you start doing this, and this is just mobile first development. There are a lot of different frameworks follow, and so does Tailwind. If you go back to the code here, this by default is actually for mobile. Now, since this is for mobile, it's a smaller device. If I want to say that for a tablet size that is 768 pixel minimum, so notice how there is min width here, not max width, then in that case, I can say when the minute it hits medium, then we want to be, or the minute from medium and over that medium and larger devices, I want grid calls to be 3, because I want the columns to be 3 whenever it's a tablet and desktop and so on, all the bigger devices. And by default, it's actually going to be 2. So let's take a look how that plays out. So for example, if we go to the app and if we shrink the page, you can see that immediately it has gone down from 3 to 2. And this is really simple, but just by adding MD. Now we don't need to add media query so and so. It has automatically added this media query of min width 768 pixel. So we don't need to do that over and over again, which makes our life really simple. And that's the beauty of it. Now, similarly, I want to say that the gap is fine as 2 maybe, but the minute it hits tablet, I really want the gap to be maybe huge, something like 12 or something. So like 3 rem or something like that. So similarly, now you can see the gap is a lot more between elements, but the minute we shrink it, it reduces because on a smaller device, we don't have that much room. So this makes it really simple. And now that we're here, let's also add some margin top and bottom here. So on this specific element. So we can just say margin vertical to be 20. Again, it gives it a little bit more room. And one trick to design in general is that when in doubt, add more spacing to make your design look a lot better. Our application is slowly starting to come together to look exactly like our other application. Now that we know a little bit more about responsive design, we could also start making sure that the headings as well has some sort of breakpoints too, so that this heading is not huge on a smaller device. So for example, if you go to global CSS, here we can say that for maybe larger devices, we want to be 6XL, but by default, we want H1 to be 5XL. Maybe keep it the same because H2 is a smaller text in general for our case. So for example, here we have this, but then the minute it reduces, you can see that for mobile, it becomes a little bit smaller, which is exactly what we want. So again, it's like so much easier to write responsive styling in general, which is really great. And lastly, we can add one more styling, which is for large, the margin Y is going to be a lot more. So maybe let's just say 32. because again, for desktop and bigger screens, we want the margin to be a lot more compared to like mobile devices where we have less space. Let's talk about borders now. So in Tailwind, again, there are utilities for adding border radius, width, colors, dividers, and lots more. So let's explore that a bit here. So for example, if I want to make sure that my border radius, that is the corners of my a specific square or rectangle, whatever the corners are, I want it to be like curved, rounded in general. You can do that in Tailwind, and I love this utility for this reason. So for example, you could use something like rounded, which would add round corners in general, but also like rounded MD would make it more rounded and so on. Or if you just want it to be like a circle, then you could do that with rounded full. And this is very helpful if you're adding a profile photo and so on, or any other in any of your products as well. So this makes it really simple. So you can also make it like build buttons rounded, then rounded none would just make it like a rectangle, depending on your text and so on. So this is like this is a really useful functionality in general. The other thing that it also does is that you can also add border width. So for example, if you want a specific border in general to your element, so like border would just add a thin 1 pixel border, then or like border one would, I believe, add a 1 pixel border, or like I guess border two in this case would add like a 2 pixel border, and then border two would be the 2 pixel, border four would be 4 pixel, border 8 would be 8 pixel, and so on. And then you can also set the color of the border as well by just saying border and then the name of the color. You could do that in a lot of utilities as we have seen already. If you want the background color, then you can say background color and so on. So that's like really great about adding borders and so on in general. And at the same time, if you just want to add border top, then you can just say border top 4, 6, 8, whatever they have in general. So that really helps. And lastly, you can also add horizontal and vertical borders as well. So if we go back to our code, rather, if we go back to our app, you can see we do have these really cool borders. Now, forget the hover in general, but like if you see like these purple borders right here, they are beautiful and they are also rounded. So let's do that right now in our application, because right now our app looks like this, and we want to make sure that we are adding a border in for that specific card. So over here we have this specific div, which is basically the container of it. So we can just say class name and then give it a border 2. Then we can just make it border indigo, maybe 400. Let's see all the indigo colors, 400. And then we can also round the borders. And then these are all the different ways you can round it. I'm just going to say Excel because I don't want it to be too rounded. Now, if we go back here, you can see that we have a really nice border. At the same time, we have the border corners to be rounded as well. But as you can see, this photo and this text is really left aligned. We want to make sure that there's some padding to it. So what we could do is we can just say P5, which will give it, or let's say PX5 in general, like let's say PX5. So this gives us left and right. And then we can say PY maybe, or I guess we could say PY2. And this gives more. But again, you can see that because of this text, we probably want more at the bottom and less at the top. So we can just say PT is 2, but PB is more maybe. So you can say PB is 5. So now we have a lot more spacing here. And we can also say margin auto, which makes it center as well. So all these elements are centered inside the specific border. So again, like having these borders are really a game changer. Now, what we could do is we could also do the same for the images as well, because like we see over here, we also have the images curved. So similarly, we could just add class name here to the image, and then we can say rounded XL. Say rounded XL, maybe this is too much, so we can say rounded large. And there you go. So rounded large has also rounded the images in general, as you can see right here, which is really beautiful. And if you want, we can also give it a little bit of spacing between the name and the image. Maybe my is 3. And then this way, it has given some sort of a spacing between the name and the image, making it look a lot better in general. And here we can just reduce the spacing a little bit. All right, so now our cards are looking really good thanks to borders. And now we have these cards that look really great. But there's one more thing. We want to make sure the borders are not so thick, or maybe they are thick, but we don't want it to be so visible. And for that, we also have a specific border opacity utility as well that Tailwind provides us. So we can just say border opacity, and then we can say we want the specific opacity of the border to be reduced to whatever we want it to be. So if I say 50, and if we go back, now you can see that this specific border looks a lot better than before. Again, depending on your design, you could do whatever you like, but Tailwind also provides us utilities to reduce the border opacity that we like as well. If you want to control the box shadow of an element or the drop shadow of an element, then Tailwind provides us with utilities as well that you can use. So for example, the box shadow utility will allow us to control the box shadow of an element. So you can say that shadow hyphen MD, large XL to XL. Again, it's the same convention, small, MD, large, XL, 2XL, and so on. And in this case, it will allow us to add shadow to all the layers. But let's say if you just want to add outer shadow, then you can do that. But if you do want to add an inner shadow, then you can just do shadow hyphen inner. Now, this is for box shadow, but if you want to add a drop shadow, then you could also do the same. So you can just say drop shadow MD, drop shadow large, and so on. This will in fact add a filter property of drop shadow, whereas the box shadow will add literally a box shadow property in CSS. So that's really good. For our application, we do want a shadow as well. So let's add that for to these cards. So, for example, over here, we can say shadow, and we have different options. We can say large, XL, 2XL, and so on. So, let's add XL as a shadow. And when we add an XL shadow, but it doesn't really show much to us. And if you go back to box shadow and shadow XL, that's fine, it works, but doesn't really it's not really visible. So we can also give it a color if you want as well. Now again, with colors, the beauty of it is that we can just say shadow and whatever color we want. So if we say shadow purple, then slash the number whatever we want, like let's say 100, then this is the shadow color purple that will be applied, which is really good with colors in general. So we can do the same here. So let's refresh the page, and because the shadow is not applied, and there you go, shadow is now available as a property. And you can see that shadow is specifically of this color, that is purple 300, and so on. We can close this. Now we have these really lovely shadows. At the same time, if you want to reduce the opacity as well, for example, of the button, then that's also another effect that you can add. This is how you add shadows in Tailwind. Now Tailwind gives us a lot of utilities, and we can also extend existing utilities or completely replace them by adding values in tailwind config.ts. What if we just want to add some one-off values, but we don't want to really update the design system? Now, I would not necessarily recommend this because you always want to stick to a design system. But obviously, there are some design constraints, or there are some design parameters. There's some designs that where we need to add something really custom that's not necessarily applicable anywhere else. And if you want to do that, then in any of the Tailwind properties, you can add a box bracket just to add that specific color or property in general. Let's say I want to add a very specific purple. So I can just say BG, and let's say none of the color is not available here at all, and I don't want to really add it to the design system either. So I could just easily say 5755 EB. Now you can see that if I hover over it, for example, you can see that this specific background color has been applied to BG, and background color has been taken the value of the color RGB value that I have provided. So you could do the same with background, but you can do it the same with pretty much anything. So in our case, if you want to also do shadow and provide a specific shadow value, then you could do the same by adding whatever shadow that you want in general. So that is essentially the beauty of Tailwind as well, that you can also add like custom values if you want to. Tailwind also allows us to add a bunch of different CSS filters in our apps. We already saw drop shadow filter, for example. We can also add blur. We can also change the brightness of specific elements. We could add a hue rotate, which changes the colors. You can also make it like you can really have a lot of fun with it. Now, in our application, you can see that there is some sort of a backdrop blur. Like we're also trying to add a blur property here. So Tailwind has a backdrop blur filter, which will make it give it this glass-like effect, which is something that's really cool. We could do that with Tailwind. So we could just copy this specific property, and going back here, we can just add it. Now, if we add it, you can see that this does give it the backdrop blur that we want, and it makes it look like a glass-like thing. This is also called as glass morphism, for example, where it gives you this glass-like blur, backdrop blur that you're looking for. But you can also change the backdrop brightness if you like, or the grayscale, the hue. You can rotate it, or the change the hue colors in general. So there are a lot of different filters that you could add that to basically add different filters in CSS and make your application really fun, especially images. So definitely have fun with it as you build this specific app. Tailwind also has a bunch of text specific properties that are really handy. So, for example, in our case, we have a bunch of dog names: Sydney, Dora, Kobe, and so on. But let's say Kobe's name is not just Kobe, but it's actually really long. So, for example, if I change Kobe's name to Kita, Kulkarni, whatever, right? If I do that, now it takes up a new line. But let's say I don't want that as a feature. I just want a dot, 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 and ellipsis whenever the text overflows. Now, typically in CSS, we would add a text overflow property and then add white space, no wrap, or and things like that in general in CSS, in the CSS world. We could do a lot with text overflow properties in general to make our text shrink or add an ellipsis and so on. You could do the same with Tailwind, and Tailwind does provide us with a bunch of utilities for text. So if we go to text overflow, you can see we could truncate the property, which is basically overflow hidden, overflow ellipsis, and white space, no wrap. Now we could essentially use truncate, and this will add that ellipsis that we want. So if we do that, for example, in our H2, we can just say, just truncate it and go back here. You can see that this is almost working, but it is expanding our card. So we can give it a width in general. So we can just say whenever it goes beyond width 60, then truncate it. Now, as we do that, now it has that ellipses that we want. But let's say we don't want these properties and we just want an ellipsis in general for something like this to truncate the overflowing text if needed, then we can just add these two properties. Similarly, if you just want to clip it, then we can do that. But not just that, we also have the for text, we also have indentation, which is really good, vertical align. If you want to add an underline, an overline, and so on, then Tailwind does provide us with a lot of different text specific utilities to control the decoration of that specific text or to control the style of the specific text, which is really handy in general. So if you want to do that, then 100% just go ahead and add whatever properties that you're looking for to the text elements to make it look the way you want it to. So now let's just remove the specific text because we don't need that. And we have already added the truncate to the name. So that's all for text properties. Now, for the application that we are trying to build, our images are not just in one position. we are essentially transforming them into different positions. Now, if we were to implement the same thing in CSS, we would use a transform property just to like skew them or rotate them, and so on. Now, with Tailwind, we do have a bunch of utilities for that specifically so that we could transform them the way we like. So let's take a look at that. So so over here, you can see scale, rotate, translate, skew, transform origin, and so on. So for example, the scale property allows us to scale the elements, either make the elements larger or smaller than the base image or size in general. So for example, if you see, if base is scale 100, which is the image that we see right now as base, then scale 75 is going to make it smaller and 125 is going to make it larger. Similarly, we could scale it to -50 as well if you want. We could also rotate it to any degree that we want it to. We can rotate it to 45 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, and so on. Similarly, we could translate the elements as well to move up and down in general. And we can skew them so that they are not in the exact specific element, so that they are slightly tilted or slightly skewed from its original position. So we could do all of this in Tailwind, and that's exactly what we are doing over here in this specific app of ours. So if you were to do the same here, then you can imagine that every single card here would require a different transform property altogether. So this is quite big, this is big, this is big, but these three not so big. And this one is rotated, this one is fully rotated, and they are all in different positions in general. So we need a transform or some sort of a utility for every single image or every single card in this specific array. So for that, we could add a new property called as transform to each of these dogs so that we could transform them the way we like. And when we are destructuring name, we could also destructure that specific property and call it here. So for that, we could turn this into a string literal. So we could call the property that we want. So let's call that transform. Similarly, let's destructure transform, and let's give transform property to Sydney and give Sydney some sort of a scale. So we can say scale 110, and then let's rotate her as well. So we can say rotate 6, or the opposite direction, then we can make it negative. And if we go back here, you can see that Sydney is tilted. We have a rotated Sydney, and we have also scaled Sydney as well. Similarly, we could make Dora a little smaller. So same thing, give it a transform property, and here we can say Dora is going to be 75. And look at that, Dora is 75. Now, among all of these, Danny is little specials because you can see that Danny is also skewed to the left as well. So we could do the same for Danny too. So if you look at the skew property, we could say skew by 6 or skew by 3 or whatever else that we like. Danny, we could scale Danny back again to 75 because we want Danny to be smaller. We could rotate Danny as well. And then we could use skew y6. We could translate as well from its original position and translate y to 15. If we do that, if we go back here, you can see that now Danny is in fact a lot smaller. Danny has skewed and so on. So we could do the same thing for Kobe as well, where we are changing the original position of Kobe using translate. We are scaling it and so on. Now I have already done a lot of that for us and all these different properties. So we could basically just go ahead and I'll copy paste it. You can see like that, like they have rotated and skewed and transformed in general, all the dogs, because I've copy pasted that. But you can do whatever you want and play around with these different properties, these different transform utilities that we have for scaling elements back and forth, because that is going to be really useful for you and make the application however you like as well. Now, you can handle states such as hover state, focus states, and so on inside Tailwind using utilities as well. Now, If you were to do the same in CSS, you would basically use the property colon and the class name itself. And that's essentially this way you would add hover state and focus state and so on. That's the same idea with Tailwind, except that since hover is a utility, you can add hover on top of any element that can accept an hover or focus states in general. So for example, over here, we can see that we have a button and there's a background sky 700 that has been applied on the hover property. So the way you can add hover is just by hover colon and so on. So you can see that the color changes the minute we hover. Now, similarly, there are several other classes as well, such as on hover, it's this one, then there is active, there is focus, and so on. If I were to focus on it, then there's no outline, and there would be essentially a ring over here, just like they have added here. So you could basically apply any states as you like, and these specific states would be more relevant in a form compared to what we are doing right now. But in a form, you could add different sort of states for input buttons, for text boxes, check boxes, radio buttons, and so on. But this is essentially how you add states in Tailwind. So in our application, we want to use the hover state. That is, whenever we hover over a specific card, we want that card to scale a bit. Now, because there are different scaling properties already applied, you are going to get this really cool effect of scale up and down depending on what transform property we have provided. So what we could do is inside of our card component, we could just add here that hover, and let's change the color to maybe G purple 200. Then we can also say scale it to 105 as well. Now, as you do that, let's see what happens. Now, if we go back to our app, you can see that we are getting this hover property, which is really great, which is exactly what we want. But you can sort of see already what our next topic is going to be because there's no animation here. The transition is not that smooth. That's exactly what we will be focusing on next. Animations are one of my favorite ways of making an application look really good, whether it be through transitions, spinners, and a lot of different motions in general. Tailwind does make animation little easy in general through utilities, but I still feel that it has a long way to go because there are not that many animation utilities as you would like, but there are a few that you can still use to make the application look great. So, for example, in our application, as we saw, we want the hover state to be really smooth. We don't want it to be like this because it's not great. It doesn't look good because there's that sudden effect of hover. It just goes from 0 to 100 really quickly. What we want is a sort of like a transition, which probably slowly changes the state in general. So for that, we could start using animations in Tailwind. So we could look into the property called transition. It is used for controlling the transition in general. And again, if you were to do the same thing in CSS, you can see what all you need to do. So for example, if you were to use transition all, then you would need to add these three properties: cubic bezier, transition duration, and so on. So for example, you can see that it is actually bulging out, easing out, I would say, versus if you were to look at the duration property, then first is 150, but the more the duration, the slower the effect is. And this is exactly what we want in our card here. We want the duration to be really slow as we transition from one state to the other state. So what we could do is we could add a duration over here. So we can say on hover, we do want the duration to be 500. And we also need to add the property transition for duration to work. So again, on hover, let's do that. So if we go back here, you can see that suddenly our cards are transitioning at a really slower pace, which is what we want. If you want to make it slower, we can change the duration, we can increase the duration, or reduce it if you want it to be faster. And lastly, there is also the animation itself. Now, there are specific utilities for for animating elements in Tailwind, such as spin, such as transactions, which is like a ping. And then there's an animate pulse, which is just like a pulse if you want to show like a loader of some sort, and a bounce as well. So now we could easily take in bounce if we like, and then just add it on hover too. But if I wanted to get rid of this altogether and go back here and go back, you can see that all these card elements are essentially bouncing now. Now, if you have a use case for that in your application, then it's great. You can definitely use all of these animations. But just like I mentioned earlier, Tailwind is not an animation library. So you don't have a lot of animation utilities as you would want compared to what, let's say, Framer Motion or some other tools that might provide you. So there are animations, and you can customize these animations as well. But again, they're not that many, so we are a little bit restricted in Tailwind in that case. But since we don't want animation bounds in our application, let's go back to what we had earlier. We had animation, duration, and so on. So this is what we had before, and we are back to that. It is a crime in today's world if you are a developer building your application and you don't have dark mode. Every application needs to have dark mode because we all use dark mode by default, and your application shouldn't look bad when you switch from light mode to dark mode in general. So, for example, in this application, if I were to go to my system preferences and change it to dark mode, then you can see this is how the application looks like. But in Tailwind, we can easily configure dark mode and light mode very easily. So for example, if we go to dark mode in the documentation, you you really need to add the class dark right here in front of anything to say that when it switches to dark mode, that's the property we want to apply. So that just makes it really easy. And by default, this uses the prefers color scheme CSS media feature, allows you to toggle dark mode and light mode easily in CSS and using Tailwind. We could go here and just say that if it's dark mode, then I want the color to be maybe like slate 500, just to try it out. And if you go back here, now you can see that this is the dark mode of the app. Now, just for fun, we don't want this, but when it's a dark mode, we want grayscale. And look at that. Now, grayscale, if we go to the documentation, is in fact a CSS filter. So we could make it really fun and say that whenever it's dark mode, all our images and everything needs to be grayscale. So this is exactly how you see the application in grayscale. But it is really simple to add dark mode in your application, and you're just adding the prefix dark colon to any property to enable that in specifically dark mode.